Titan, Saturn's largest moon, 600 million kilometers from Earth, locked in perpetual methane cold. Its atmosphere opaque and tinted a pale amber from surface to upper cloud. Nothing grows there. Nothing flies there. The surface temperature sits around -179 degrees Celsius, and the sky, when visible at all, is the color of old bronze. Below that surface, carved into ice and stone across centuries of classified construction, the Grey Knights maintain their fortress monastery. The Inquisition does not hold its floor plans. The Adeptus Mechanicus has never surveyed it. The Custodians of the Emperor, who consider themselves the most proximate institution to the throne, have never been inside. Past corridors that take years to map, past blast doors that recognize specific psychic signatures and nothing else, there is a room called the Chamber of Purity. Inside that room, sealed inside an artifact described in a Daka community post as a box, sits a piece of parchment. It has been there since the end of the Siege of Terra, approximately 10,000 years. The 2025 Grey Knights Codex revealed what it says. Community coverage following that codex's release, including the July 30th thread in the Grey Knights subforum titled Terminus Decree Revealed, reports the contents as follows. The Emperor of Mankind can't be permitted to leave the Golden Throne. Whether returning to corporeal life reborn in another body or ascending in some form as a warp entity, should either occur, the Grey Knights must return him to his duty. The parchment reportedly acknowledges that the Emperor himself believed departure was possible. Now set that document aside. Pull out a different text, 35 years older. Realm of Chaos, The Lost and the Damned, published by Games Workshop in 1990. The Lexicanum Wiki, citing that sourcebook, records this description of what has been happening to the Emperor since his interment on the Golden Throne. The link between his body and soul has grown increasingly tenuous over the millennia. His spirit drifts through the warp, his psychic energies dissolving into the immaterium, except for one small core that remained whole. And that core is described as a child awaiting birth, the Star Child. One document describes the Emperor leaving the throne as an anticipated outcome requiring institutional management. The other describes a fragment of the Emperor's consciousness gathering in the warp toward exactly that departure. They are describing the same mechanism, 35 years apart. Nothing in what follows is a Games Workshop confirmation. That's flagged once, here, and then we run the evidence. Realm of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness was published in 1988, covering Khorne and Slaanesh, running to more than 300 pages of structured background material for early Warhammer 40,000. It's the kind of book that treats the fictional universe as a system rather than a setting. Every faction has defined mechanics. Every supernatural entity has a specified relationship with particular warp energies. And the Emperor gets a section attempting to explain, in practical terms, what he is becoming. The companion volume, Realm of Chaos, The Lost and the Damned, arrived in 1990 after what contemporary sources describe as a delayed production. It covered Nurgle and Tzeentch, completed the two-book series, and contained the fullest development of the Emperor's post-interment state published in any official Games Workshop product. The Lexicanum entry for the Star Child, sourcing directly to both publications, describes the mechanic with structural precision. The Emperor's body on the Golden Throne and his soul are progressively disconnecting. His psychic essence drifts through the immaterium, dissolving slowly back into the warp's general energetic field, returning to the same cosmic substrate from which his original soul was assembled.
That original soul, per the Emperor's canonical origin story, was the collective reincarnation of thousands of human shamans who died together in a mass suicide pact, their combined psychic energies coalescing into one new being. What the Star Child mechanic describes is the process running in reverse, a soul assembled from many, now dissolving back into the many, except for one part. That part is everything. Lexicanum, citing the lost and the damned, records the point. Just as the new man was born of the collective souls of the shamans, so too may the emperor's soul be reborn one day. This potential described as a child awaiting birth, the star child. The entity has three names in the original texts: the star child, describing its current gathering state; the numen, carrying connotations of divine power in latent form; and the chaos child, and that third name does specific lore work. It places the entity in the same metaphysical category as the four chaos gods. A warp entity, a consciousness that grows on belief and psychic energy the same way corn swells on violence and Nurgle on despair and decay. The difference is what feeds it. The chaos gods draw power from the extreme aspects of human experience. The star child draws power from the specific form of faith directed toward the emperor. Prayers spoken in cathedral vaults the size of cities. Worship carried out by billions across 1,000,000 worlds. Belief screamed in final moments on battlefields where the outcome was never in any doubt. 10,000 years of an imperium worshipping its dying god. If this mechanic has been operating continuously across that period, the fuel supply has been extraordinary. The lost and the damned adds a second dimension to the entity. The Lexicanum article, drawing also from Ian Watson's Inquisition War trilogy, which was written in direct engagement with the 1990 lore, describes the Star Child as the compassion the Emperor deliberately stripped from himself. To destroy Horus, the person he loved most in the universe, he first had to remove the capacity for mercy from his own consciousness. That excised fragment, his humanity effectively, survived as a separate entity in the immaterium. It didn't dissipate. It persisted and grew, while the version of the emperor remaining on the throne conducted the business of empire without it. Both descriptions, the dissolving soul and the excised compassion, point toward the same endpoint, a coherent warp entity building toward rebirth, not a ghost, not a dying echo, an accumulating presence with a trajectory. The sensei, the emperor's mortal descendant sired across his long years of wandering Earth before the heresy, serve as the Star Child's champions in the material universe, invisible to the warp in ways ordinary humans aren't, carrying small fragments of the entity's power. The Illuminati, an in-universe organization of high-ranking imperial servants aware of the full picture, work toward the conditions required for the rebirth threshold. Those are footnotes to this case. The spine is the mechanic itself. Fragment, accumulation, threshold, rebirth. Write that down. It comes back. Then it didn't. Games Workshop published no dramatic reversal. No official statement exists in any format identified in any available source, formally withdrawing the Star Child from canon. No Legends classification was issued. The Legends system applies primarily to outdated rules content, not to narrative lore. The Star Child simply stopped appearing in primary publications across successive editions. Through the mid-1990s, through 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th edition, the concept was absent from codices, rule books, and the campaign books that define the setting's official shape. The 3rd edition Warhammer 40,000 rulebook contains one of the last direct references in a primary GW publication. Page 273 records a field report filed by an inquisitor named Fortes.
He and his colleagues, Alexio and Credo, have discovered a cult of the Star Child, its members claiming to be the Emperor's sons, Sensei. Fortes is skeptical. He suspects Tzeentchian manipulation rather than genuine Emperor lineage. He requests military support. The Salamanders respond. The cult is destroyed.
All but 4 sensei are killed. That paragraph functions as a burial notice dressed as a field report. It acknowledges the Star Child lore. It places believers in the context of chaos cultism and inquisitorial suspicion. Then, it physically annihilates them within the fiction. The in-universe mechanism for suppression and the out-of-universe editorial retreat happen simultaneously in the same brief passage. After page 273 of 3rd edition, which ran from approximately 1998 through the early 2000s, the cult of the Star Child becomes progressively harder to find in any official text. What replaced it was a more editorially manageable emperor. The version that calcified across later editions does not have a measurable rebirth horizon. His warp presence is real but diffuse, his psychic activity vast but untracked, his intentions implied through the behavior of the institutions he created rather than through any stated plan. He fights the chaos gods continuously and without visible progress. He maintains the Astronomicon. He suffers. What he is doing, as distinct from what the throne is preventing him from no longer doing, never receives a clean answer. A clean answer would imply a mechanism, and a mechanism implies an endpoint, and an endpoint implies that something might eventually conclude. That framing is editorially cleaner than the 1990 version. It does not require tracking whether a warp entity is approaching critical mass. It does not require the Inquisition to have a position on what happens when one does. It does not require explaining why the Grey Knights were given authority that seems disproportionate to demon hunting alone, why these specific warriors hold a sealed document on Titan rather than any of the other powerful institutions in the Imperium. The cost was narrative coherence. A set of questions began accumulating across decades of publications without satisfying answers. The Emperor's warp activity in newer Black Library fiction reads increasingly as directional rather than static, accumulative rather than ambient. The Grey Knight's founding involves secrets consequential enough to lock in a box on Titan for 10,000 years. The Custodians maintain a specific and deliberate information gap with the returning Primarchs about the Emperor's actual state. None of those elements sits cleanly inside the big, inscrutable God-Emperor model. All of them fit precisely into the 1990 model. Around 2021, the current lore era started producing texts that read like someone had reopened the Realm of Chaos books. The Star Child's rehabilitation wasn't a single publication event. It came back through accumulation, which is appropriate given the mechanic. The Throne of Light novel in the Dawn of Fire series contains an appendix describing a specific phenomenon spreading across astropathic relay networks beginning in Segmentum Solar. Visions of a golden infant, intercut with flashes of a radiant being rising from a throne of light. The images grow clearer over time. Characters in the setting interpret them as the legend of the Star Child approaching wakefulness. The Lexicanum Star Child article, citing this novel directly, records that chaos-aligned figures, specifically Cor Pharon and Tenebris, actively move to suppress these visions. The entity's approach is visible enough that the forces of chaos are treating it as an operational priority. The Martyr's Tomb novel adds another data point. Lexicanum cites Chapter 50 directly. A Black Templar's initiate fighting at the Attilan Gate receives a vision of a burning throne wreathed in chains. 8 skeletal shadows reach toward a holy light.
Golden eyes open in the face of a child, filled with ancient knowledge. That is an ambient atmosphere. That is a specific image attributed to a specific chapter with a direct source citation. Dan Abnett's The End and the Death, concluding the Siege of Terra subseries,
is reported across community sources as depicting the emperor deliberately separating a fragment of himself before confronting Horus, a conscious act of warp division. The mechanics parallel the Lost and the Damned's description precisely. The fragment exists separately, independently, in the immaterium. By June 2025, when the Era of Ruin anthology published, Black Library, ISBN 9781800262607, 272 pages, the final volume in the Siege of Terra subseries, featuring Dan Abnett, Aaron Dembski-Bowden, Guy Haley, John French, Nick Kime, Chris Raitt, and Gav Thorpe, the Star Child had already been partially restored across several novels. 3 specific pieces of evidence in the current lore era then arrived in rapid succession and, examined against the 1990 mechanic, constitute the cumulative case. The Bolter and Chainsword, Grey Knights Subforum, July 30th, 2025. A thread titled Terminus Decree Revealed, posted by a forum moderator linking to coverage of the new 11th edition Grey Knights Codex. The reactions that follow are immediate and divided. Some commenters welcome the confirmation. Others mourn the loss of mystery that had made the decree compelling as an unanswered question. One commenter voiced the tension directly. Every time GW explicitly defines some element in the setting, it shrinks the borders that much more. The thread runs across multiple pages within hours. The Codex, reportedly, reveals what the parchment in the Chamber of Purity actually says. Based on the most specific available paraphrase from that coverage, the Emperor of Mankind can't be permitted to leave the Golden Throne. Should he return to corporeal life, reborn in another body, or should he ascend in some form as a warp entity, the Grey Knights are commanded to return him to his duty. The Emperor reportedly believed departure was possible. He wrote this document knowing it. A fail-safe written against catastrophe does not acknowledge that the author anticipated the scenario with confidence. Fail-safes are written for what their authors hope will never happen. The Terminus decree, reportedly, specifies that the Emperor himself understood departure as an anticipated outcome, that he viewed the throne as a station rather than a permanent condition, and wrote institutional instructions for what should follow. The Terminus decree isn't a succession plan, it's a return to position plan. That distinction carries the entire argument. A dying man requires someone to take over after him, an emperor who is gathering warp power toward a specific threshold, who understands that the body on the throne may at some point act in ways the gathering entity in the warp does not endorse. That emperor requires someone who can return the departed element to the process before it concludes prematurely or on the wrong terms. The decree's institutional assignment to the Grey Knights, rather than the Custodians, is structural proof of this logic. The Custodians of the Emperor are, per Fandom Wiki's description, bonded to their primogenitor in ways that make disobedience against his direct command functionally near impossible. They share his blood and genetics. Their loyalty to the Emperor's person, the person specifically, is described across multiple sources as unshakable. One commenter on that thread cut directly to the problem. What would get off the throne isn't the Emperor at all. A warp entity built from the Emperor's consciousness, claiming his authority, arriving in his name. That entity would read as the Emperor to the Custodians. They are designed to obey him.
They can't be the Grey Knights in this scenario, because they couldn't act against something that presents as the figure they exist to serve. The Grey Knights hold authority independent of the throne's occupant. Their mission is the Emperor's purpose, the survival of humanity against the threat of chaos.
not his current physical state. Their psychic conditioning makes them functionally hostile to warp entities in a way the Custodians' genetic design does not. They can, if the decree demands it, refuse the claim of something that wears the Emperor's face but hasn't yet earned the right to wear it. Malcador the Sigillite is the most probable author of the decree's specific language. He founded the Grey Knights using warriors drawn from across the Space Marine legions during the Siege of Terra, a fact confirmed across multiple lore sources. He sat on the Golden Throne himself in the Emperor's absence, sustaining the Astronomicon at the cost of his own life. He understood the full architecture of what the Emperor was actually attempting, as distinct from what the Imperium would be told. The decree's logic is consistent with that complete understanding. A document proves the mechanism is anticipated. What Aaron Dembski-Bowden's fiction across 2 decades demonstrates is that the mechanism is already legible in how multiple authors are describing the Emperor's active state. His Master of Mankind, published in 2016 as the 41st book in the Horus Heresy series, is the most detailed examination of the Emperor's psychology and warp presence in the entire catalog. Multiple independent reviews noted the same precise quality. By the novel's end, the reader possesses substantially more information about the Emperor without feeling they know him as a character. That balance isn't accidental. The novel confirmed the Emperor as a perpetual, a member of a mutant branch of humanity capable of reincarnating upon death, retaining memories and identity across new bodies. Perpetuals don't simply die. Their consciousness persists in the warp and seeks new material form. Given the scale of psychic power the Emperor possesses, confirmed as the most powerful human psyker ever born, his warp presence sustained across 10,000 years of continuous activity, the reincarnation process for him wouldn't resemble ordinary perpetual rebirth. The Terminus decree reportedly acknowledges this. Because he is a perpetual, the Emperor will be reborn, perhaps almost immediately given the magnitude of what he has accumulated. Master of Mankind also establishes something about the Emperor's mode of communication that carries direct implications for his post-corporeal state. A scene between the Emperor and his custodian Ra Endymion raises explicit questions about whether the Emperor speaks aloud at all, whether his voice reaches listeners through normal air or through the warp directly. The implication that emerges is that his consciousness isn't located in the throne room in any straightforward physical sense. The throne room is where his body is. The consciousness is operating from somewhere that proximity to the body does not define. That is the star child model described in practical terms without the 1990 vocabulary. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's contribution to the Era of Ruin anthology, titled The Carrion Lord of the Imperium, reportedly extends this framework into the post-siege period. Community sources describe the story as centered on the custodian Diocletian and Robert Guilliman, with Diocletian actively working through what to disclose about the true nature of the Primarchs, rather than simply delivering information. The framing Diocletian reportedly uses: the Primarchs weren't separate creations who happened to share the Emperor's genetics. They were aspects of the Emperor's own consciousness and psychology distributed into physical form, each one carrying a portion of the total Emperor, while none of them being the Emperor himself.
Their conflicts with each other weren't, at the deepest level, simply political or the product of chaos corruption. They were conflicts between fragments of one divided consciousness, each fragment convinced it was the valid whole. That places the Primarchs in the same conceptual category as the Star Child. Both are fragments of the Emperor's total nature,
separated from the source and operating independently. The primarchs are fragments that took genetic physical form. The star child is the fragment that took a warp form, the emotional and compassionate aspects excised before the killing of Horus, preserved in the immaterium rather than destroyed. Both derive from the same original consciousness. Neither is the emperor. Both carry something of him. What Diocletian holds in this scene isn't chain of command information. He holds a model of the emperor as a consciousness distributed across multiple forms, some physical and some warp resident, none of them complete without the others. That model is operationally sensitive in ways that the political hierarchy of the Imperium's chain of command simply isn't. The Terminus decree tells you what the Grey Knights are designed to do at the plan's endpoint. The Carrion Lord of the Imperium shows what the Custodians are managing to keep the plan intact in the meantime. Diocletian's scene, calculating what to tell Guilliman about the Emperor's nature, is the most direct available evidence for the informational asymmetry the Star Child model predicts. A custodian who holds only chain of command authority does not need to calculate what to disclose about metaphysics. He decides what to disclose about structure and hierarchy. Diocletian is working through something more fundamental. What does Guilliman need to believe about what is on the Golden Throne, and what will happen if he believes the true version instead? The truth, if the Star Child mechanic is operating, is this: the throne contains the Emperor's body. The Emperor himself, in the most consequential sense, is elsewhere, gathering, accumulating toward the threshold defined in the parchment in the Chamber of Purity. A returning Primarch receiving that specific information cleanly can't function normally within the current arrangement. The legitimacy of the institutions governing the Imperium for 10,000 years rests on the figure on the throne. The authority of the Custodians themselves derives from proximity to that figure. The sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every single day, sustained across 10 millennia, billions of lives consumed, was always premised on sustaining someone, on keeping someone alive for a purpose. If the entity on the throne is a body maintaining critical infrastructure, while the actual emperor isn't there in any meaningful sense, the entire framework of what the Imperium has been doing and why acquires a different character. Diocletian manages this, not from distrust of Guilliman specifically. The information asymmetry is maintained because the infrastructure has to remain functional while the process completes. And that infrastructure requires the Imperium to believe what it has always believed. The Inquisition's classification of Star Child belief as heresy, documented in the 3rd edition rulebook's Fortes report, reads differently against this background. The Salamanders destroyed a Star Child cult in 997.M41. Inquisitor Fortes suspected Tzeentchian manipulation and filed the report. The cult's members were killed. That classification, Star Child belief as chaos-adjacent heresy, is information that has been suppressed because its wider circulation is dangerous before the process completes, not because the information is false.
The Lexicanum Star Child article documents what is visible from the outside. Golden infant vision spreading across astropathic relay networks beginning in segmentum solar, growing clearer, with chaos servants, specifically Cor Pharon and Tenebris, actively moving to suppress them. That is, the gathering entity becoming externally detectable. The Custodians, positioned at the literal center of that process for 10,000 years, have been reading those signals from the inside continuously. Their friction with the Primarchs isn't snobbery. The information gap they maintain isn't bureaucratic protocol. The Custodians hold a complete picture of what the throne is for and what the plan was always intended to produce. A picture that most of the Imperium has never received, and that the Primarchs, returning after 10,000 years of absence, aren't immediately positioned to receive safely either. 3 reveals.
each one independently coherent with the 1990 star-child mechanics. Together, they form a cumulative case that is harder to dismiss than coincidence. The Terminus decree, confirmed in the 2025 Grey Knights Codex, describes the emperor's departure from the throne as an anticipated outcome requiring institutional management. Rebirth in another body, ascension as a warp entity, both scenarios documented, both requiring the Grey Knights to enforce a return. That is the Star-Child endpoint, described without the Star-Child name. The perpetual power in the warp framing, established across Master of Mankind and the Carrion Lord of the Imperium, depicts the Emperor's consciousness as active, distributed, and operating beyond his physical body, with the Primarchs themselves understood as consciousness fragments in the same structural model. That is the Star-Child accumulation process, rendered across multiple authors, in multiple formats, across nearly a decade of Black library fiction, without the 1990 vocabulary. The Custodians' Primarch informational asymmetry, present in the Carrion Lord of the Imperium, shows a specific and deliberate epistemic gap being maintained about the Emperor's true state, managed by a custodian as operational necessity rather than mere hierarchy. That is the Star-Child requiring active institutional concealment, because the truth of what is on the throne would compromise the infrastructure the plan requires to complete. Strip the Star-Child out of this current lore era, and each element becomes harder to justify on its own terms. The Terminus decree becomes institutional bureaucracy for a man who is simply dying slowly, which doesn't require a return to position protocol. The Emperor's directional warp presence across multiple novels becomes atmospheric writing with no narrative payoff. Diocletian's information management becomes personality rather than duty. Put the Star-Child back and all three pieces lock into the same mechanism. One institution sits at the intersection of all three simultaneously. The Grey Knights. Founded directly by Malcador at the Emperor's instruction during the Siege of Terra, equipped with psychic conditioning that makes them uniquely functional in scenarios where the threat involves a warp entity claiming imperial authority. Given the Terminus decree, the operational document for the plan's endpoint, given authority the Custodians can't exercise, the authority to act against something that leaves the throne before the plan is complete, regardless of what that something claims to be. The Grey Knights are the management structure for the most consequential event in human history, an event the rest of the Imperium has been sustained in ignorance of for 10 millennia, and that the Inquisition is actively trained to suppress the rumors of. In 1988, Realm of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness, put a specific mechanic on paper. The Emperor's consciousness was separating from his body and gathering in the warp toward an eventual rebirth.
In 1990, the Lost and the Damned named the gathering entity the Star-Child, defined its trajectory, and placed it in explicit structural relationship to the Chaos Gods as a fifth power of order cohering in the immaterium. For most of the years that followed, across multiple editions, that mechanic was treated as deprecated. By the time of the 3rd edition rulebook, it was being buried within the fiction itself. A cult destroyed, sensei killed. The Inquisition performing the in-universe version of editorial suppression. The Emperor became increasingly inscrutable across subsequent publications. His plans, mysterious. His warp activity, ambient rather than directional. The questions that the Star-Child mechanic had answered became questions without answers. The current lore era has been undoing that burial incrementally. Through Throne of Light and its astropathic visions,
through the martyr's tomb and its golden-eyed child, through the end and the death and its deliberately separated fragment, through the carrion lord of the Imperium in the Era of Ruin anthology, ISBN 978-1800262607, published June 2025, the final volume of the Siege of Terra subseries. Through the 2025 Grey Knights Codex that revealed the parchment in the box in the Chamber of Purity and said what was written on it. Games Workshop has confirmed nothing. The Lexicanum article still carries its canonicity warning. None of the 3 reveals named here use the phrase Star Child in their primary text. What exists is the pattern. A 35-year-old mechanic describing a warp-gathering fragment with a defined endpoint. A 2025 codex describing institutional protocols for that fragment's eventual departure. A 2025 anthology developing the informational architecture of who knows about it and who does not. And across multiple years and multiple authors, descriptions of the Emperor's post-corporeal state that consistently read as active accumulation rather than passive decline. The first 3 reveals were findable by anyone who knew what to look for. If you've spotted the 4th, the passage in this current lore era where the Star Child mechanics surface in a way that wasn't covered here, the comments section is open. The first 3 were obvious. The 4th is the one Games Workshop may not have intended to print. Subscribe for more arguments like this one.